The royal guards are famous for their discipline and composure, but what happens when a crime unfolds right in front of them? One guard found himself in a situation where he couldn't move, couldn't speak, and yet he had to act. What he did next left the entire crowd stunned, and proved that even without moving an inch, a royal guard can make all the difference. Every year, millions of visitors gather outside Buckingham Palace, drawn by the allure of its grandeur and the stoic presence of the royal guards. To most, the guards are little more than a symbol of tradition, silent, unshakable, and almost statue-like in their stillness. But behind the polished buttons and iconic bearskin hats lies a sharp mind trained to notice every detail, every movement, every potential threat. On this particular day, one guard would prove that even without moving an inch, he could make a difference no one would forget. The sun shone brightly over the palace gates, casting a golden glow on the bustling crowd. Tourists snapped photos, children waved excitedly, and street performers entertained passers-by with music and tricks. It was a lively, cheerful scene, the kind of day that seemed far removed from anything dramatic or dangerous. Among the guards standing at attention was James Whittaker, a 32-year-old veteran with a decade of service. His uniform was immaculate, his posture flawless, and his expression calm. To the untrained eye, he was just another guard, blending seamlessly into the tradition he represented. But James was no ordinary man. Before donning the red tunic and tall bearskin hat, James had served in the British Army, completing 2 tours in Iraq. There, he had learned the importance of composure, observation, and quick thinking, skills that had saved lives in the chaos of war. Now those same skills served him in a very different setting. For James, standing guard wasn't just a job. It was a duty, a living tribute to the values he held dear: honor, discipline, and vigilance. He had sworn to protect the palace, the royal family, and the traditions they represented, no matter the cost. And today, that duty would be tested in a way he never expected. The crowd outside the gates was a mix of families, couples, and solo travelers, all eager to capture the perfect photo or catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard. Children laughed and pointed, teenagers posed for selfies, and a middle-aged woman fumbled with her camera bag, trying to juggle a map and her phone at the same time. It was a scene of pure, carefree tourism. But not everyone in the crowd was there to admire the palace. A man in his late 20s moved through the throng with practiced ease. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, he blended in perfectly, his movements smooth and unremarkable. But his eyes told a different story. They darted from person to person, scanning the crowd with sharp intent. To most, he was just another tourist. To James, he was something else entirely. James's sharp eyes caught the man's movements almost immediately. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way his gaze lingered on certain people, that set off alarm bells in James's mind. Years of military training had taught him to read people, to notice the subtle signs of someone with bad intentions, and this man had all the signs. The man's attention settled on the middle-aged woman with the camera bag. She was distracted, her focus split between her belongings and the map in her hand. Her bag hung loosely at her side, the zipper slightly open, revealing the edge of a wallet tucked into the side pocket. She had no idea she was being watched. The man moved closer, his steps deliberate but unhurried. He pretended to admire the palace, his head turning as if to take in the view, but his eyes never left the woman's bag. James watched him carefully, his body still as stone, his face betraying nothing. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak, he couldn't even break his stance. But that didn't mean he was powerless. The man sidled up to the woman, his hand slipping into her bag with practiced ease. It was a move so quick, so subtle that most of the crowd didn't notice, but James did. His mind raced. He couldn't shout a warning or step forward to intervene. His duty as a royal guard demanded absolute stillness no matter the situation. But James wasn't just a guard. He was a soldier, a man trained to think on his feet and adapt to any challenge. And in that moment, He knew exactly what to do. The pickpocket moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. His hand slipped into the woman's bag, fingers brushing against the edge of her wallet. She remained completely unaware, still focused on the map in her hand, oblivious to the man standing so close. It was a perfect opportunity. Too perfect. James's eyes followed the man's every move. He couldn't shout, couldn't gesture, couldn't even break his stance. The rules of his duty were clear. Absolute stillness. No. Matter what. But James knew he had to act. But it had to be subtle. So subtle that no one in the crowd would even notice. His gaze shifted just slightly toward the palace security officer stationed nearby. It was a movement so small, so imperceptible, that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. But the officer, trained to pick up on the guard's silent signals, caught it immediately. The pickpocket, still unaware that he was being watched, pulled the wallet free and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He turned to leave, blending back into the crowd with practiced ease. But James's silent alert had already set things in motion. The security officer moved quickly, weaving through the crowd with purpose. He approached the pickpocket from behind, his steps quiet but deliberate. The man didn't notice until it was too late. A firm hand clamped down on his shoulder, and the officer's voice cut through the noise of the crowd. "Excuse me, sir. I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you." The pickpocket froze, his face a mix of shock and panic. The officer reached into the man's jacket and pulled out the stolen wallet, holding it up for the crowd to see. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as the woman, now realizing what had happened, clutched her bag in disbelief. "That's mine," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. The officer handed the wallet back to her, then turned his attention back to the pickpocket. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, leading the man away. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of relief and admiration sweeping over them. Some began to whisper, pointing toward James. They had started to piece it together. The guard had seen it all, had acted without moving a muscle, and had silently orchestrated the entire thing. But James didn't react. He stood as still as ever, his face calm and composed as if nothing had happened. To him, it wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about doing his duty, protecting the people and the traditions he had sworn to uphold. The woman, still clutching her wallet, looked toward James with tears in her eyes. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," even though she knew he wouldn't respond. And yet, in that moment, she felt certain that he had seen her gratitude. As the pickpocket was led away, the crowd began to settle, though the buzz of excitement lingered in the air. People whispered to one another, their eyes darting between the security officer and the unflinching guard who had seemingly done nothing, and yet everything. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs. "Mom, did you see that?" The guard stopped the bad guy. His mother smiled, glancing at James. "I think you're right," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure how. James remained motionless, his gaze fixed ahead, as if the entire incident had never happened. But inside, his mind was still sharp, replaying the events. He had seen the man's intent from the moment he entered the crowd. The way his eyes scanned for vulnerabilities, the way he moved with purpose, it was all too familiar. James had seen that same look during his military service in places where danger lurked in the smallest of movements. He thought back to his training, to the countless hours spent learning to read people, to notice the details others missed. A hand lingering too long near a pocket, a glance that didn't match the casual demeanor of the rest of the crowd. These were the signs he had been taught to recognize, and today they had made all the difference. The woman, still clutching her wallet, lingered near the gates. She looked at James, her expression a mix of gratitude and awe. She wanted to say something, to thank him properly, but she knew the rules. The guards didn't speak, didn't move, didn't acknowledge the crowd, and yet she felt certain that he had seen her. Nearby, a group of teenagers who had been laughing and joking earlier now stood quietly, their eyes fixed on James. One of them muttered, "I didn't think they actually did anything. Guess I was wrong." The crowd began to disperse, the excitement fading as people returned to their sightseeing and photo taking. But for those who had witnessed what had happened, the moment lingered. They had seen something extraordinary, a guard who had acted without breaking a single rule, who had protected someone without moving an inch. For James, the applause and whispers meant little. His focus remained on the crowd, scanning for any other signs of trouble. His duty wasn't over, and it wouldn't be until his shift ended. He had been trained to stay composed, to let the world move around him while he remained steady. And so, he stood, as still and silent as ever, a symbol of discipline and vigilance. Later that evening, after his shift had ended, James returned to the barracks. The weight of the bearskin hat was gone, but the sense of responsibility lingered. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened. For him, it wasn't a story to share or a moment to boast about. It was simply part of the job, but the woman didn't forget. A few days later, a letter arrived at Buckingham Palace, addressed to the royal guards. In it, she described what had happened, praising the guard who had noticed the pickpocket and acted without hesitation. She called him a hero, though James would never use that word to describe himself. The letter was read aloud to the guards during their briefing the next morning. Some of his colleagues glanced at James, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. But James said nothing, his face as calm and composed as it had been the day before. For him, it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what was right, about upholding the values he had sworn to protect. And as he prepared for another day of standing watch, he felt a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't moved an inch, but he had made a difference. The story of what had happened outside Buckingham Palace began to spread. Tourists who had been there shared their accounts with friends and family, and soon, the tale of the guard who stopped a pickpocket without moving began to take on a life of its own. Some embellished the details, claiming the guard had somehow communicated telepathically with security, while others marveled at his discipline and sharp instincts. For James, none of this mattered. He wasn't interested in the attention or the growing whispers of admiration. His focus remained on his duty, the same as it had always been. But for those who had witnessed the event, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. The young boy who had pointed out the guard to his mother now told the story to his classmates, his eyes wide with excitement. "He didn't even move," he exclaimed. "He just stood there, but he saw everything. It was like he had superpowers or something." The woman whose wallet had been saved shared her gratitude with anyone who would listen. "I don't know how he did it," she said, "but that guard saved me. He didn't have to move or say a word, he just knew. I'll never forget him." Even the teenagers who had mocked the guards earlier left with a newfound respect. "I guess there's more to them than just standing still," one of them admitted. "They're not just statues, they're watching everything." The royal guards had always been a symbol of tradition, discipline, and honor. But for those who had been there that day, they became something more. They saw the guards not just as ceremonial figures, but as protectors, silent, vigilant, and ready to act when it mattered most. James, of course, never spoke about what had happened. He didn't need to. His actions, or rather his stillness, had spoken louder than words ever could. As he stood at his post the next day, the crowd once again gathered around him, snapping photos and waving. He remained as stoic as ever, his gaze steady, his posture unyielding. But somewhere in that crowd, someone would look at him differently. They would see not just a guard, but a quiet hero. And perhaps they would wonder what other stories these silent sentinels carried, hidden behind their unflinching composure. Because sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't loud or flashy. Sometimes they happen in silence without a single step being taken. What do you think about the incredible discipline and quick thinking of the royal guards? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating tales of honor, tradition, and quiet heroism. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.